In 1600, England was just a damp island on the edge of Europe, impoverished, exhausted from civil war, ravaged by plagues with meager trade and chaotic finances. The royal treasury was empty, the navy weak, farmers living in hunger, and London merely a muddy city full of coal smoke and the stench of decay. No one at that time could imagine that this small, resource-poor land would become the center of the planet's most powerful economy. Yet 3 centuries later, in 1900, the world awoke to a new order created by that very island. London was now the global financial capital, where international capital was borrowed, lent, and priced. The Royal Navy was the strongest naval force in human history, controlling vital trade routes from the Atlantic to the Indian Ocean. The British Empire spanned 5 continents, ruling a quarter of humanity and operating a trade network covering more than half the world. An island nation, once so poor it had to borrow to survive, had become the center of the first global economic system in history. This contrast is almost absurd. How could a small, backward country, inferior to the Netherlands, Spain, and France, rise to surpass them all and become the world's superpower? It was not a miracle of luck, but a miracle built with intent. A sophisticated and ruthless economic machine combining sea power, modern finance, coercive trade, and industrial technology. This is the story of the first global economic miracle in human history. Throughout the 17th century, the island that would become the world's center of power started as the weakest nation in Western Europe, with nothing but a series of recurring crises. England in 1600 was not the image of a rising empire, but of a land struggling to survive amid poverty, disease, and decades of political chaos. It was a society that had never truly been stable. Famines occurred in cycles, destroying crops and killing already impoverished communities. The plague swept into London and major cities, wiping out tens of thousands every few years. The royal treasury was nearly empty, dependent on heavy taxes, asset seizures, or loans from wealthy merchants, and the state structure was so fragile that even a minor disruption could shatter political balance. England had no superior agricultural output, no gold or silver mines, no efficient banking system, no large fleets, no pioneering science or technology, and certainly no brand of power comparable to Spain, France, or the Netherlands. On the European continent, England was not a leader. It was merely a secondary nation, always lagging behind the times. Things worsened with civil wars that devastated society. The power struggle between the king and parliament plunged the country into chaos. Royal and parliamentary armies clashed on the very fields that fed the people. Taxes soared, trade collapsed, ports were blockaded. In that context, a major plague in 1665 killed about a quarter of London's population, and the Great Fire of 1666 burned most of the city, leaving a capital in mourning and ruins. Nothing in this picture suggested England would become a world-shaping force. Meanwhile, a few hundred miles to the east, the Netherlands was the true shining star. That was the dominant trading empire of the time. Amsterdam merchants controlled most spice, silk, sugar, and luxury goods, trade from Asia. The Bank of Amsterdam effectively served as Europe's central bank. The Dutch fleet was the largest on the planet, the fastest, cheapest, and most efficient. The Dutch East India Company was the world's most powerful enterprise, with its own army, colonies, and power exceeding its home nation. In the eyes of 17th century Europe, the Netherlands was the ideal model of mercantilism, while England was just a drab country trying to imitate but never catching up. The Dutch grew rich through trade, while the English still relied on heavy taxes and borrowing to pay soldiers. The Dutch dominated the Indian Ocean, while the English struggled to maintain a few sea routes to North America. The Netherlands had a modern financial system, while England didn't even have a central bank. All this made England from 1600 to 1688 look like a desperate laggard, crushed by stronger, richer, and better organized rivals. But the paradox lies here that very poverty, instability, and weakness created the fertile ground for the greatest turning point in world economic history. When a society falls into prolonged deadlock, it has only 2 choices: accept perpetual inferiority or completely recreate its power structure. England chose the second path. The brutal civil wars made the English realize that the king could not rule alone. The empty treasury forced them to invent new forms of finance. Defeat by the Dutch made them learn to control the seas, and constant competition forced them to build entirely new trade rules. Every element of the English miracle originated from this dark period. This was not a miraculous rise from the heavens, but the result of persistent historical pressure, change, or disappear from the race for power. The big question planted in this era, and the one guiding the entire story, is how did a nation inferior in every way, from military to trade, from finance to state organization, become the world's first economic hegemon? And how did a resource-poor island create an economic model that the entire modern world now operates on? The answer begins with the macro reconstruction of 1688, the starting point of an empire that would shape the next 3 centuries. But the true turning point did not come from a battle or a technological discovery, but from an institutional reversal called the Glorious Revolution of 1688, an understated event but perhaps the most important economic milestone in all of Western history. It began when English nobles, merchants, and parliamentarians united to overthrow James II, a king seen as tyrannical, incompetent, and clueless about public finance. What the English did in 1688 was not just replace a king, but overhaul the entire power structure for the first time in European history. A nation decided that supreme power lay not with the monarch but with Parliament, especially those who controlled taxes, budgets, and public spending. For an American audience, this was the moment England transformed itself into a primitive version of checks and balances. The king could not borrow recklessly, spend arbitrarily, tax whimsically, and had to depend on economic representatives to maintain the state apparatus. And this very constraint on power paved the way for something no one at the time could foresee: the birth of a modern financial system strong enough to nurture a global empire. Just 6 years after the Glorious Revolution, the English created the first tool of the miracle, the Bank of England, established in 1694. Unlike previous loose royal banks, the Bank of England was a hybrid institution, half public, half private, playing a role that a modern American audience might envision as a blend of the Fed and the Treasury. It was created with a very American goal to help the government borrow money cheaply, quickly, and stably. A group of merchants and financiers lent money to the government. In return, they gained the right to issue paper money, earn interest on government bonds, and participate directly in running the national financial system. The true power of the Bank of England lay not in its building or vaults, but in an extremely modern idea. The government could borrow from the market, and the market trusted the government's ability to repay because the post-Glorious Revolution political system made default nearly impossible. From here, a national debt, national public debt, was formed. It sounds ordinary to Americans today, but in 1694 it was a revolutionary invention. Before that, a king's debt was personal, and European kings frequently defaulted, causing chain reactions of lost confidence. But in England, public debt was a safe asset. It was guaranteed by Parliament, it was highly legal, it could be traded, it could be pledged, it could be bundled into more complex financial instruments. In just a few decades, England's national debt became the safest haven in Europe, similar to the status of U.S. Treasury bonds today. And just like the United States in the 20th century, England used public debt to do what rivals could not: fund long-term wars, build a massive navy, finance colonial enterprises, and expand influence globally. But that was only the first engine of the machine. The second engine emerged in parallel: the explosion of joint stock companies, the first true corporations. If the Bank of England was the 17th century Fed, then joint stock companies were the early NASDAQ. They allowed investors to pool large capital from hundreds, even thousands of small shareholders, to create enterprises capable of what individuals or families could not: funding round-the-world voyages, hiring private armies, opening new trade routes, building forts, seizing colonies, operating ports. For Americans, this model resembles a multinational corporation combined with private equity, but granted state-like powers. The pinnacle of this structure was the English East India Company, a trading organization that owned tax collection rights, maintained an army of over 250,000, and operated territory larger than the Roman Empire at its peak. This was not a business, it was a mechanism for enforcing sovereignty on behalf of the state. But no matter how powerful the East India Company was, it could not function without what the Bank of England and national debt had just created: massive capital flows streaming continuously from London. When a nation can borrow quickly, guarantee debt credibility with a balanced political system, and mobilize private capital through joint stock companies, the entire financial structure becomes an endless growth engine. An American audience can see clear parallels. U.S. military power relies on the Treasury bond market. American corporations rely on deep capital markets, and the global trade system relies on trust that the White House will not default. England invented this very model 300 years earlier. That was the magic institutions, something no prior empire had ever possessed: a state strong enough to mobilize capital, transparent enough to build trust, flexible enough to link with merchants, and ambitious enough to expand worldwide. The combination of the Glorious Revolution, Bank of England, national debt, and joint stock companies created the first foundation for the English miracle, an economy running not just on resources but on trust, capitalization, and the ability to turn every risk into an opportunity for expansion. From an impoverished island, England had just invented three pillars of the modern global economy: a monarchy with limited power, deep capital markets, and private enterprises capable of acting as an extended arm of the state. This was the moment the superpower's launchpad was installed, and from 1707 onward that machinery would start operating not piecemeal but all at once, creating growth rates that left all of Europe in shocked awe. In 1707, with the Act of Union uniting England and Scotland into Great Britain, the world's first economic machine was truly switched on. If the Glorious Revolution and the birth of the Bank of England were the institutional foundation, then 1707 was the moment the entire system began operating as a unified engine. A new state, richer in capital, more stable, and most importantly, capable of mobilizing resources on a scale no European power had ever achieved. The merger with Scotland was not just a political event, it was an economic explosion. Scotland brought into the Union a rising network of merchants, skilled sailors, strategic ports, and especially access to markets previously barred to them under the Navigation Acts. In return, they gained access to the English financial system, from government bonds to banks to London's capital flows. These two energy streams, merging, created an advantage that the Netherlands and France could not defend against in time, a trading empire ready to expand at an unprecedented speed. From this point, trade was no longer just an economic activity. It was a strategic weapon, and Great Britain possessed the blueprint for that new cannon. The Royal Navy, already restructured and funded by the public debt system, began acting as the police force of the oceans, protecting British merchant ships, attacking rivals' vessels, seizing new ports, and opening sea routes far beyond the Netherlands' capabilities. Financial power allowed them to do what other nations could only dream of: wage continuous wars without bankruptcy. Every new ship launched from yards in Portsmouth or Chatham was not paid for with gold, but with trust in government bonds, which investors across Europe were eager to buy due to the stability of the post-1688 system. This was a massive strategic innovation. The Dutch were skilled at trade but could not borrow to sustain long wars. France had Europe's strongest army but chaotic finances that drained funds quickly. Spain was overly dependent on colonial gold and silver. Britain was different. They had discovered what we now call financial firepower, the ability to pour unlimited capital into trade and military without being constrained by traditional treasuries. The result was a century-long trade boom. British ships reached the Caribbean, North America, Africa, the Indian Ocean, and East Asia. Each new route not only brought goods back to London, but also taxes, customs duties, commodity taxes, import-export taxes, and these taxes fed back into the Navy, making Britain richer, more expansive, and able to collect even more taxes. This was the first loop of the British machine: trade taxes, navy trade. But from the second half of the 18th century, a second loop began overlaying the first industrialization. While trade brought money and resources to Britain, the demand to produce goods more cheaply, to compete, to sell to colonies, to exchange for raw materials, created pressure for technological innovation. That pressure led to a series of inventions that changed humanity's trajectory. James Watt's steam engine, mechanical looms, cheap iron smelting, rotary engines, early railways. The key point is that none of these innovations appeared in a vacuum. They emerged because the trade navy finance machine had created enough capital, markets, raw materials, and incentives for industrialization. Industrialization in turn accelerated trade. British textiles were so cheap they undercut entire Indian markets. British iron and steel flooded Europe and America. British steam-powered ships gradually replaced sailing vessels, speeding up goods transport. A new pattern emerged: industry, cheap goods, colonial markets, revenue, taxes, capita industry. The trade loop and industrial loop overlapped, creating a self-sustaining super-growth cycle. London became the world's capital distribution center. British banks became Europe's most reputable financial institutions. British government bonds became the safest assets, and all this turned Britain into the only nation capable of sustaining decades-long wars against France, its greatest rival. The War of the Spanish Succession, the 7 Years' War, and then the prolonged conflicts during Napoleon all consumed enormous resources. But instead of exhaustion like France, Britain grew stronger. The more war, the more they borrowed. The more borrowing, the more navy expansion. The more navy, the more disruption of rivals' trade. The more disruption, the more expansion of their own markets. In 1815, after defeating Napoleon at Waterloo, Britain was not just the victor, it became the only nation with an economic model strong enough to dominate the world for the entire next century. a moment when one could clearly see the scale of the activated growth machine. But unlike Germany, Britain did not create its miracle with one person. They created it with a system, a state that knew how to borrow, a navy that knew how to dominate, a trade that knew how to profit, an industry that knew how to innovate. The machine was complete. And from here on, it would operate with such momentum that no empire could compete throughout the 19th century. And at the center of that entire machine was the British Empire's #1 economic weapon, the Royal Navy, a force that not only protected trade but turned the oceans into the exclusive asset of a single nation. While continental powers like France, Austria, or later Germany were tied down by terrain and borders, Britain was the only country that could use the sea as a form of strategic infrastructure, free, unlimited, and impossible to occupy. The Royal Navy was not just a navy, it was the most sophisticated system of economic coercion in the pre-modern era. When wanting to open a new trade route, the Navy escorted convoys into distant waters. When wanting to cripple rivals, they applied blockades sealing sea lanes, so French, Spanish, or Dutch goods could not circulate. When wanting cheaper expansion, they used privateers, licensed pirates that destroyed rivals' trade, but brought profits to London. Every British ship was not just a warship, but a mobile tax station, an armed bank, a declaration of power on the water. For Britain, the sea itself was the resource, an endless reservoir of power that only they had the capacity to exploit. The Royal Navy controlled goods, routes, silver flows, insurance, and thereby the entire global trade flow. This was the first engine of the British miracle, a military force that turned trade into a weapon and the oceans into open borders, serving only the empire. If the Royal Navy was the fist, then the navigation acts were the hand gripping the entire global trade flow, a set of laws ensuring every sea route, no matter where it started, ended in London, enacted from the mid-17th century and tightened through the 18th. These acts stipulated that all goods imported into or exported from the British Empire could only be carried on British-flagged ships, crewed by British sailors, and most had to pass through British ports before reaching their final destination. If Schacht, in the German story, controlled prices and quotas to keep the economy in hand, the British controlled not prices but the entire pipeline of trade. Any colony wanting to sell sugar, cotton, tobacco, tea, or spices had to ship goods to London to pay duties, undergo inspection, and pass through British merchants' hands. The result was a form of price control on a global scale. The British did not need to fix prices, they only needed to fix the route. And when you control the route, you control the profits. The Navigation Acts turned London into the world's mandatory transit point and made the empire dominate not just with warships, but with rules they themselves wrote. But no law or fleet could expand the empire at the speed and scale of the third machine. The East India Company, an organization so bizarre it would be hard to believe by today's standards, half private enterprise, half state apparatus, operating like a multinational corporation but possessing the powers of a sovereign nation. If Mifo bills in the Nazi Germany story were a secret financial tool allowing the state to spend undetected, then the East India Company was the extreme version. A shell company enabling the British Empire to expand territory, collect taxes, and wage wars without Parliament bearing direct responsibility. Founded in 1600 but exploding after 1707, the company had a private army of over 250,000, larger than Britain's army in many periods, with artillery, cavalry, its own fleet, and complex administration across India and Southeast Asia. It could sign treaties, declare war, seize territory, force local kingdoms to pay tribute, and most importantly, collect taxes directly from tens of millions of Indian people. The East India Company's profits did not come from pure trade, but from seizing control of an entire region's economy larger than Europe. The combination of military power and privatized risk made the company the perfect tool for the British Empire. All benefits flowed to London, while costs, famine, unrest, violence were pushed onto the colonies. This was the logic of imperial privatization. The state used business to expand power, business used the state to maximize profits. And when the two entities merged, the line between trade and conquest nearly vanished. But if the East India Company was the tool for power expansion, then the fourth machine, the slave trade, was the most ruthless capital accumulation source in the entire British miracle. An engine the empire deliberately hid behind polished history pages. This was the dark capital of the 18th century. An economic model revolving around the slave trade triangle where British ships carried industrial goods to West Africa, exchanged them for captured people, transported them to the Caribbean and North America to sell as commodities, then loaded ships with sugar, cotton, tobacco, and rum to bring back to London. Profits at each leg were enormous and almost labor cost-free, because labor was coerced. Like personal capital controls in the German story, this system relied on stripping assets, freedom, and even human bodies to protect the empire's balance of payments. About 3 million people were transported on British ships, and each such vessel was a profit production line. Capital accumulated from slavery was reinvested into the navy, ports, textile mills, banks, feeding the entire British growth machine. Without this dark capital flow, the British miracle would not have reached such speed. But in every historical lesson the empire retold, this was always the part they spoke of least, because it was where growth and cruelty merged so completely they could not be separated. The dark capital from the slave trade was only the starting point. The next step of the British machine was to build an organized, precise, and thorough resource extraction system that became the operating foundation of the entire empire. Colonial extraction was not just exploitation, it was a global value allocation mechanism, equivalent to shocks, quotas plus resource allocation, but applied across entire continents. In India, the colonial apparatus imposed direct taxes on farmers, forcing them to grow cotton, wheat, and opium according to British market demands, rather than their own survival needs. Tax collection waves and forced exports caused millions to starve while grain-laden ships still left the port of Calcutta. In the Caribbean, sugar plantations generated profits while maintaining a violent order in Africa. Minerals and precious woods were sucked back to London as strategic raw materials for industrialization. This was not trade exchange. It was a one-way model where Britain decided who produced, what was produced, and to whom it was sold. Every valuable resource was funneled to London, feeding the navy, factories, banks, and consolidating superpower status. Colonial extraction became the lifeblood of the British miracle, a continuous, enduring, and uncontestable value flow by any other domestic economy. The accumulation of resources, taxes, and capital from the colonies created an inevitable consequence. Britain possessed not only wealth, but all the conditions to enter an acceleration phase that no European power could match. The Industrial Revolution did not erupt in Britain by chance. It was the sixth engine, a turbocharger turning structural advantages into absolute power. James Watt's steam engine unlocked stable, cheap energy independent of wind or water power. Abraham Darby's iron smelting industry drastically cut metal production costs, enabling bridges, ships, and tools to be built at unprecedented speeds. Mechanical looms turned textiles into an industrial assembly line that destroyed all competitors. As cotton raw materials from India and America flowed into Liverpool, Manchester factories operated like money printing machines, producing goods so cheaply that all of Europe could not compete. Productivity was so high that the Dutch, French, or Spanish were pushed out of markets even in their own homelands. This was the British Empire's second monopoly, this time not on the seas but on productivity, by controlling technology, supply chains, and input resources. Britain did not just sell goods, they set prices, standards, and the pace the world was forced to follow. The Industrial Revolution transformed the trade-navy resource machine into a continuously accelerating growth system, stronger each year than the last, and propelled the British Empire into an unrivaled position for nearly a century. Explosive industrial power needed a financial brain large enough to coordinate, and that was the role of the seventh engine. The City of London, humanity's first modern financial center, where every capital flow from colonies, trade, and industry was filtered, priced, and reallocated. If the Reichsbank in the German story controlled the economy through interest rates and quotas, the City of London did the same, but on a global scale they ensured every transoceanic voyage, issued bonds to feed the navy, lent to allied governments, and turned trade risks into financial profits through instruments that a modern American audience might see as primitive versions of the derivatives market. From here, London was not just where goods were bought and sold, but where capital was created. Banks, insurance companies, investment funds, and brokerage networks formed a capital market so deep that Amsterdam could not compete. The City of London became the empire's central coordinator, deciding who got loans, who got insurance, who expanded, who was forced to shrink. And once the world's financial center was in your hands, the entire world had to operate by the rules you set. And when the City of London had become the world's financial center, the final engine of the British machine began operating. the sterling system, the system that turned the British pound into the first global reserve currency in history. This completed the loop, equivalent to Schacht's attempt to maintain balance of payment stability for Germany. But on a scale far beyond one nation, the whole world used the pound for transactions, reserves, borrowing, and payments. When a currency becomes the international settlement standard, the issuing nation essentially gains the privilege of printing power. European governments held pounds in reserve. Commercial banks used pounds to finance trade. Businesses paid in pounds when buying from India, China, Africa, or the Caribbean. This allowed Britain to borrow at extremely low interest rates, because global demand to hold pounds was always high. It also let them spend heavily on the navy, wars, and colonial expansion without fear of capital flight. Like the United States after World War II with the USD, Britain possessed imperial privilege, borrowing in its own currency, while most of the world had to earn that very currency through labor, resources, and exports. This was the darkest economic tool on a macro scale without direct taxation. Britain could still suck global value simply by letting others use their money. The sterling system closed the final loop. Trade created pound demand. Pounds enabled cheap borrowing, borrowed capital fed the navy. The navy maintained trade. A complete, self-reinforcing cycle that for nearly a century was nearly unbreakable. When the sterling loop was complete, and the empire emerged from the war against Napoleon with absolute victory in 1815, the British economic machine shifted from acceleration to domination, entering the era history calls Pax Britannica, a long century when the world was almost entirely enveloped by London's rules, goods, currency, and naval power. Not just a moment of power display, but an age when Britain became the global economic standard. No nation from 1815-1914 could compete. Britain controlled nearly all strategic sea routes, operated a fleet larger than the next two navies combined. World trade depended on British insurance, credit, and merchant ships, and markets in India, China, Africa, and the Caribbean became near mandatory consumers of British goods. If the earlier part described how the empire built the system, Pax Britannica was the phase when that system reached absolute maturity. Industry created goods, colonies supplied raw materials, trade generated taxes, London provided loans, sterling ensured stability, the Royal Navy maintained security, a closed circle, operating with almost no friction. Britain's industrialization was not just faster than rivals, it occurred at a pace continental Europe could not imagine. In 1850, Britain produced over 50% of the world's coal, 50% of iron and steel, and nearly 70% of global textile exports. Manchester was called the workshop of the world, where goods were produced so quickly that costs fell continuously, pushing France, Germany, Italy, and Russia out of international markets. When other nations tried to industrialize, they had to buy British machines, hire British engineers, and borrow from British banks, leading to the paradox. Even efforts to catch up to Britain brought profits back to Britain. And because Britain was the first economy capable of large-scale capital export, they built a transcontinental financial network. British money constructed railways in Argentina, mines in South Africa, ports in India, banks in Hong Kong, undersea cables connecting London to New York, Calcutta, Melbourne, and Cape Town. If you lived in 1880, every major investment, from Argentine bonds to Malayan rubber companies, was priced in London. If you wanted to expand trade, you bought insurance from Lloyd's. If you wanted loans, you went to the city. If you wanted machinery, you ordered from Birmingham or Manchester. If you wanted to ship goods, you hired British-flagged vessels. Financial control led to supply chain control. Supply chain control led to rules control. Rules control led to Pax Britannica, a world operating in a way that maximized benefits for Britain without needing constant violent coercion. The Royal Navy at this point was not just a military force, it was the planet's trade police. British warships patrolled from Cape Town to Singapore, from Malta to Jamaica, ensuring every sea lane was safe, but safe in the sense safe for British ships, goods, merchants. When conflict arose, the Navy blockaded immediately. When any nation threatened the trade structure, Britain sent gunboats to their harbors. China refused to open trade. Opium wars. Argentina tried to stop British capital flows. London Chamber of Commerce applied pressure. Egypt lost debt repayment ability. Britain seized the Suez Canal outright. Free trade in the Pax Britannica era meant freedom for Britain, for the world. It was a system they were forced to join or be cut off from global capital, credit, and insurance. The pinnacle of that power was most visible in 1890, when London became the planet's richest city. Limestone white bank buildings, trading floors flooded with letters and telegrams, steam trains flowing in and out of ports, like the red blood of the global economy. Undersea telegraph cables connecting London directly to 5 continents, giving Britain information faster than any power. Not just goods and capital flowed into London, the entire world flowed into London. This was when the empire stood at an untouchable peak. Every growth curve pointed upward. Every rival lagged behind. Every variable was controlled. From 1815 to 1914, Britain possessed what the United States would recreate a century later, a global system built from industrial, financial, legal, and naval power, complete to the point of seeming invincible. But like every historical peak, absolute stability concealed the first cracks. Cracks that would become visible in the early 20th century when imitators began to surpass the very rule makers. But every peak has its shadow, and behind the glory of Pax Britannica was a structure that even the most perceptive British acknowledged. This miracle was free only for the British. The rest of the world paid the price. If the previous sections describe the completeness of the growth machine, this one is the cost that engine imposed on the lands beneath its wheels. The British Empire chose to push all costs beyond its borders. Domestically, the British enjoyed cheap goods, cheap credit, abundant capital, low taxes, and sustainable markets. Abroad, millions lived in conditions designed to optimize profits for London, not for themselves. This was the dark side of the miracle coerced colonies, suppressed uprisings, trade control, economic punishment, and resource extraction to exhaustion. India was the clearest example. While London was flooded with cheap goods from Manchester, Indian weavers, once the world's premier center of fine textiles, were hit with heavy taxes, export bans, and forced to buy British textiles. The entire native handicraft industry collapsed, leaving millions without livelihoods. As British industrial demand grew, colonial authorities forced farmers to switch from food crops to cotton or opium, sharply reducing food reserves. The result was systemic famines from Bengal to Deccan. Prolonged starvations killed millions, while grain was still regularly exported to Britain to stabilize prices. This was a form of global price control. Food prices in London were kept low by letting India pay with the lives of its own people. When Indians rose up from the 1857 rebellion to numerous local movements, Britain's response was always the same: military suppression, mass executions, property destruction, and tighter control in the hands of colonial officials. The system never admitted fault. It only tightened because every crack was seen as obstructing the value flow to London. In China, the miracle's cost appeared in another form: coerced trade. When the Qing dynasty refused to open to British goods, fearing societal disruption, the British Empire responded by pushing opium into China, first through the East India Company, then private traders protected by the Royal Navy. When the court tried to ban opium, Britain launched the Opium Wars, forcing China to sign unequal treaties, open 5 trade ports, cede Hong Kong, and accept British control over tariffs. That was not free trade. It was trade at gunpoint. The British Empire called it opening markets. The Chinese called it a century of humiliation. In Africa and the Caribbean, the model took yet another hue: forced labor, poll taxes, plantation camps, and coerced focus on producing commodities Europe needed, from cocoa, sugar, to rubber and rare metals. These policies led to a vicious cycle. Communities were forced to work in the colonial system to earn money for taxes, while taxes were the tool to sustain the colonial regime. A coercion loop, designed so no one could escape. Even in so-called successful colonies like Australia, Canada, or New Zealand, they were built on land seizures and erasure of indigenous cultures. No region was entirely immune to the machine's price. The telling point is that most of these costs were not counted in GDP. The British Empire hid costs by pushing them outward, making the domestic market look clean, efficient, and rational. Growth was portrayed as the inevitable result of British talent and discipline. But beneath that narrative was a paradox. The more the system optimized for London, the more it strangled other lands. If Schacht controlled wages by law, Britain controlled global value by structure: who produced, what was produced, to whom it was sold, and where prices had to be. The beautiful numbers in London's ledgers were offset by nameless figures in Bengal, Guangzhou, Jamaica, or Lagos. And if we understand the British miracle as an economic engineering feat, we must also understand its shadow as an inseparable part. A growth model that only worked when the world was rearranged on an axis favoring Britain, sometimes by trade, sometimes by law, and very often by force. This is the hard-to-swallow truth. Stability in Pax Britannica was achieved through instability elsewhere. London's prosperity was paid for by the losses of lands under the Union Jack. The miracle worked like a perfect machine, only when costs were shifted to the periphery and benefits concentrated at the center. And like every model of absolute dominance, it created simmering tensions that would erupt as the world entered the 20th century. But every model of domination, no matter how sophisticated, eventually hits its limits. And as the 20th century dawned, the first cracks in the British machine began to show, initially small like scratches, then rapidly widening into deep fissures capable of shaking the entire empire. From 1914 to 1945, the British Empire did not just face challenges, it faced a historical paradox. The very system that elevated them to the peak was the one that brought them down. Everything that once provided strength, global trade, massive navy, colonial network, became burdens as the world changed faster than the empire could adapt. The cost of maintaining the world's largest navy skyrocketed as the US and Germany industrialized on scales surpassing Europe. The expenses of protecting sea lanes, strategic ports, core colonies ballooned to budget-breaking levels. Lands once sources of profit, India, Egypt, China, Africa, now became political burdens, with independence movements rising relentlessly. And as two new rivals entered the stage, Germany and the United States, the cracks became impossible to hide. Germany, with late but storm-like industrialization, challenged Britain's export position and market share right in Europe. With advanced science, modern machinery, high productivity, and large population, Germany became a rival Britain could not ignore. The United States, with vast size, endless resources, and an unprecedented domestic market, began producing cheaper and stronger goods. By 1910, America surpassed Britain in industrial output, something once deemed impossible. These were no longer old rivals. These were new superpowers, operating on the model Britain itself had taught the world. Industrialization plus finance plus markets. But when students grow strong, the teacher is challenged. And then World War I erupted like a brutal test of everything Britain had built. War costs spiraled beyond control. The empire was forced to borrow from the very nation it once saw as periphery, the United States. From world's creditor, Britain became New York's debtor. The Royal Navy remained strong, but no longer decisive in the war's outcome. Colonies remained vast, but could not prevent Britain's economy from exhausting itself in 4 years of fighting. Sterling remained the reserve currency, but lost most of its gold backing. And when the guns fell silent in 1918, Britain won the war. But it was a hollow victory. They emerged financially drained, indebted to America to the point of dependence, growth rates destroyed, industry lagging, and the economies surviving on capital flows they no longer controlled. Pax Britannica was no longer reality. It was only memory. The 1920s and 1930s brought no recovery. They only prolonged decline. Britain tried restoring the gold standard to maintain sterling's prestige, but it was a self-strangling decision. An overvalued rate made British goods uncompetitive. Exports fell, unemployment rose, and protests spread. The tools that once lifted Britain to the top now became shackles. Global trade collapsed in the Great Depression, supply chains shattered, capital dried up, and the massive navy became a money-eating machine with no reason to exist. Meanwhile, colonies began demanding voices. India, once the jewel in the empire's crown, became the epicenter of independence demands as Gandhi and nationalist movements rose. In the Middle East, borders Britain drew in the post-Ottoman era caused lasting instability. In Africa, small but continuous uprisings reminded that the colonial algorithm no longer worked in the modern world. And then, as if history deliberately chose Britain as the center of the harshest test, World War II broke out, and this time, the empire lacked the capacity to pay the price. The fight against Nazi Germany forced total national mobilization, destroying much industrial asset, consuming capital the empire took a century to accumulate. The Royal Navy lost absolute dominance as America entered with a massive fleet. Sterling collapsed as Britain could not maintain the gold standard. And when the war ended in 1945, Britain won militarily but lost economically. The United States became the world's creditor, owning 2/3 of global gold and controlling the new international financial institutions. The USD replaced sterling as the reserve currency. The global trade system was restructured for Washington's benefit, no longer London's rules. Colonies began gaining independence at an irreversible pace. Within 3 decades, the world's largest empire dissolved, not from direct defeat, but from internal erosion. Cost too high, growth too slow, model too old, and rivals too strong. This was the most intense phase in the entire British Empire curve, the moment when every opportunity turned to burden, every advantage to weakness, and every structure that once brought power became the reason for collapse. If Pax Britannica was the triumphant symphony, then 1945 was the breathless climax, where the metal clang of the imperial machine echoed before the entire system began to shatter. When the guns of World War II fell silent and the last armies returned home, the British Empire entered a phase they once thought would never happen: inevitable dissolution. From 1947 to 1970, this process unfolded not through grand battles like the expansion era, but through political decisions, independence declarations, and a stark economic reality. Britain no longer had the capacity to sustain the colossal structure it had built over 3 centuries. If World War II was the fatal blow, the post-war period was the empire's body failing part by part. India gained independence in 1947, followed by Pakistan, Sri Lanka, and a series of other South Asian territories. Palestine descended into conflict and ended its colonial role. Egypt reclaimed sovereignty over the Suez Canal and nearly erased Britain's presence in the Middle East. Africa erupted in liberation movements, Ghana, Nigeria, Kenya, Zambia, all successively breaking away from London, not because Britain wanted it, but because Britain had no other choice. An empire that once ruled 25% of humanity shrank to an island. Nation no longer able to dominate supply chains, markets, or global politics. And at the center of this contraction were two truths Britain's leaders had to face. 1. The empire was no longer economically viable. 2. The empire no longer had political legitimacy. The tools that once made Britain powerful, imposed trade, territorial occupation, sea lane control, had all become obsolete in a world increasingly pursuing national sovereignty and international law. But the cruelest part was Britain's model had been copied, upgraded, and surpassed. The United States emerged not just as the war's victor, but as the inheritor of the entire British imperial architecture, but on a larger scale, faster pace, and with a stronger domestic market. Pax Britannica ended to make way for Pax Americana, a new order but eerily familiar to anyone who understood the world's power structures. If the 19th century world operated around the British pound, the 20th century world operated around the US dollar. If the Royal Navy was the gatekeeper of the oceans, the US Navy became the guardian of modern maritime order. If London was the global financial center, then New York and later Washington became the heart of the world financial system. And if Britain once shaped world trade through the Opium Wars, the Treaty of Paris, or colonial agreements, America shaped the world through the IMF, World Bank, and WTO. Britain invented the global empire model. America expanded it to a level even the British could not keep up with. But precisely because of that, Britain's lesson became razor-sharp for the United States. No empire is permanent, and any system based on absolute dominance will reach the moment when benefits no longer outweigh costs. That is what Britain discovered when forced to choose between maintaining the empire and maintaining its own economy. And they chose the economy because in the end, empires do not die from defeat. They die from becoming too expensive to sustain. And that pattern, though never repeating in the exact same form, always returns by the same logic. The lesson from Britain is crystal clear from a U.S. perspective. The USD holds the position the pound once held, absolute power but fragile before structural changes. The U.S. Navy plays the role the Royal Navy once did, protecting trade, maintaining maritime order, ensuring reserve currency credibility. Pax Americana stands where Pax Britannica once stood, dominant, stable, but carrying cracks hard to see from the outside. It will not be China or Russia that destroys this order. It will be the costs of maintaining it rising faster than America's resilience, just as imperial costs once rose faster than Britain's post-war recovery. And if there is one thing Britain's history teaches the United States, it is economic power never lies in territory, armies, or resources. It lies in the ability to sustain trust in the currency, rules, and trade system you control. When that trust wavers, every empire becomes vulnerable. Not because it weakens, but because the world finds alternatives. The British Empire collapsed not in one big explosion, but in 3 decades of fatigue, loss, and adaptation. And if there is one final warning for the United States, it is history does not repeat, but patterns do. The world always changes, and every system, even the strongest, has a breaking point. All that remains is the question, will America read Britain's lesson before the power curve starts to shift? And so, looking back at the dissolution of the greatest empire of the 19th century, we do not just see an ancient story, but a mirror image of today's world. A superpower builds global order, sets the rules, controls trade, dominates finance, believes its power is default until the inertia of its own system becomes too heavy a burden. A superpower believes its currency will always be the center, its navy an impenetrable wall, its position natural and unchallengeable. Those thoughts were once true for London in 1890, and they are the thoughts Washington carries today. But the truth history records is far colder. No model is immune to time. Britain lost its empire not from battlefield defeat, but because the world changed in ways its model could no longer adapt to. America will face similar challenges. The costs of global leadership rising faster than growth, rivals copying and improving the model, Technology redefining power and allies starting to reduce dependence rather than absolute alignment. Soft power, economic power, military power, all must be continuously recreated, and the lesson London leaves is crystal clear. If an empire does not learn to change while still at the peak, it will be forced to change once it has started sliding. That is when every adjustment is too little and too late. This is not prophecy, it is just the curve. History has drawn too many times for us to pretend not to see. And if you want to understand America's future, do not look at transient debates, noisy elections, or political promises. Look at the model America lives inside. America did not replace the British Empire by destroying it. America inherited it, expanded it, accelerated it, and precisely because of that, if you want to understand America's future, look at the empire it replaced. Look at how it rose, how it operated, how it strained against forces it created itself, and how it cracked when the world no longer revolved around it. History does not repeat, but patterns do, and the imperial pattern is one of the most enduring curves humanity has ever witnessed. If you want to keep following analyses like this, razor-sharp, history model-based, uncolored, subscribe and stay. We have many more curves to read and many more futures to illuminate.